I'd reached a point in my career where I felt trapped in an endless loop. Every morning at 7:30, I'd leave the house, squeeze into a crowded subway car that smelled of stale coffee and morning anxiety, earbuds in, shutting out the world and its endless chatter. The rhythmic clacking of wheels on tracks became my meditation, the only predictable constant in a life that felt increasingly uncertain. As I walked through the glass doors of the company building, those towering sheets of reflective steel that seemed to swallow people whole, the same thought circled in my mind. Will today be any different? It never was. The elevator's soft ding announcing each floor felt like a countdown to another day of invisible servitude. For years, I'd worked at the same company, churning out the same reports on the same cream-colored paper, delivering the same presentations to the same faces around polished conference tables. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that persistent low-frequency buzz that seemed to match the background noise of my discontent. My work mattered, no question. I had a hand in projects that boosted our department's efficiency by 17%, laying the groundwork for multi-million-dollar deals that would be celebrated in corner offices with champagne I'd never taste. But the applause always went to someone else. My name was either mentioned in passing, a footnote in someone else's success story, or not at all. The office itself was a study in corporate beige, neutral carpeting that absorbed sound and ambition alike, motivational posters that hung like afterthoughts on walls painted in colors that had no name. Even the plants seemed defeated, their leaves drooping despite the artificial lighting designed to keep everything looking artificially alive. It wasn't that I hated my job. I didn't. The work challenged me intellectually. The problems were complex enough to engage my mind, and the paycheck cleared without drama. But something was missing, something that gnawed at me during those long afternoons when the sun slanted through Venetian blinds, casting prison bar shadows across my desk. It felt like I was working under an invisible glass ceiling. I could see up, could make out the shapes of success moving above me, but I couldn't break through. My boss, a man who wore expensive suits but cheap ties, as if he understood the appearance of success but not its substance, never looked at me with that future leader spark in his eyes. His gaze would slide over me in meetings, landing instead on colleagues who spoke louder, gestured more dramatically, commanded attention through sheer volume rather than substance. My colleagues saw me as reliable, hardworking, the person you could count on to deliver quality work on time, but ordinary, forgettable. The human equivalent of beige carpeting. One day, during a lunch break, as I stood in the small kitchen area that smelled perpetually of burnt coffee and microwaved leftovers, grabbing my usual black coffee from a machine that had seen better decades, a senior female colleague sidled up to me. Margaret Chen had been with the company for 15 years, had survived 3 reorganizations and 2 hostile takeover attempts. Her silver hair was always perfectly styled, her blazers pressed to razor-sharp edges, and when she spoke, people listened, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. Quiet authority wrapped in silk scarves and knowing smiles. She glanced at me with those calculating eyes that seemed to take inventory of everyone they surveyed and said, "You're too ambitious. Don't make it so obvious. Stay quiet, blend in. Managers love people who go with the flow. Trust me, I've seen ambitious people crash and burn. The ones who survive? They know when to be invisible." Her words were delivered with the confidence of someone who'd navigated these corporate waters for years, so certain and matter-of-fact that I froze mid-sip. The coffee suddenly tasted bitter, metallic. Her advice felt like an answer to the question mark I'd been carrying for years, heavy as a stone in my chest. Maybe I was doing it wrong. Maybe to rise I didn't need to stand out. I needed to fade into the background, become part of the institutional furniture until someone decided I was ready for more. That day, walking back to my desk past cubicles filled with the soft clicking of keyboards and muffled phone conversations, I decided to try it. For the next few weeks, I pulled back like a turtle retreating into its shell. I stayed silent in meetings, watching from the sidelines as discussions swirled around conference tables scarred with coffee rings and decades of decision-making. Even when I had ideas, and I had many, notebook pages filled with solutions and strategies that kept me awake at night, I held my tongue unless directly asked. The urge to speak would build in my chest like pressure in a kettle, but Margaret's voice would echo in my memory. Stay quiet, blend in. If someone said something off base, something that would cost the company time or money, I bit my lip hard enough to taste copper. Blend in, I told myself. Stay under the radar. Let others make the mistakes. But the result was the opposite of what I'd hoped. I became more invisible with each passing day, fading like a photograph left too long in sunlight. Ideas that were mine, born from late nights analyzing spreadsheets and market trends, started coming out of other people's mouths, polished and presented with the confidence I'd never allowed myself to display. The analyses I'd slaved over, cross-referencing data until my eyes burned from screen glare, were presented as someone else's work. My insights became their stepping stones. The more I stepped back, the more others stepped forward, occupying the space I'd vacated as if I'd never existed at all. The office dynamics shifted around my absence. Conversations that once included me now flowed past my desk like water around a stone. People stopped asking for my input, their eyes skipping over me in meetings to land on colleagues who hadn't learned the art of strategic invisibility. One day, in a big meeting held in the main conference room with its panoramic view of the city, where you could watch tiny figures hurry along sidewalks 20 floors below, all of them looking purposeful from this height, my boss announced he was picking a leader for a new project. The afternoon sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany table where 8 department heads sat with their leather portfolios and ambitious smiles. A spark of hope flickered inside me, weak but persistent. This was my domain, the area I'd worked on for years, where I knew every metric, every pitfall, every opportunity. My expertise lived in the margins of reports that others had taken credit for. But my name wasn't even mentioned, not even considered. They chose someone who spoke louder but knew less, someone whose confidence masked their ignorance like expensive cologne covering the smell of fear. In that moment, as the afternoon light shifted and shadows grew longer across the polished table, it felt like ice water poured through my veins. My pen trembled in my grip, leaving small marks on my notepad as I thought, my years, my effort, my sleepless nights. Why doesn't anyone care? Why doesn't anyone see me? That evening, on the subway ride home, pressed between tired commuters who stared at their phones or dozed against windows streaked with city grime, I stared out at the urban landscape blurring past. The city lights began to flicker on as dusk settled, but inside me, there was only darkness. Buildings rose like monuments to other people's ambitions while I sat invisible in a metal tube hurtling through underground tunnels. I asked myself, is this really my path? Dimming my own light to follow someone else's advice? Becoming a ghost in my own career? The answer was clear. No. That night, in my small apartment with its view of a brick wall and fire escape, a quiet rebellion sparked inside me. I didn't tell anyone yet. There was no one to tell, but deep down, staring at my reflection in the darkened window, I vowed, I'll change this system that makes me invisible. One day, my name won't just be mentioned. It'll command respect as a leader. I'll make them remember I exist. Until then, I'd only ever tried to fit in, to become part of the corporate wallpaper. But that evening, something fundamental shifted. I was done letting others' voices drown out mine, done being the supporting actor in my own professional story. For a while, though, I stuck with the silence experiment. Days turned into weeks, and autumn gave way to winter outside the office windows. At first, I thought, maybe this is the right approach. People noticed me less, which meant fewer opportunities to stumble, fewer chances for criticism. It felt like a safe zone, a comfortable invisibility. But that safety was invisibility itself, and invisibility, I was learning, was just another word for irrelevance. In meetings, I sat at the edge of the table, literally and figuratively marginalized, jotting notes in a notebook that no one would ever read, nodding along to whatever was said like a dashboard bobblehead. The conference rooms smelled of stale air and recycled ambition. their walls decorated with mission statements no one believed, and charts showing growth that never seemed to translate to individual recognition. When an idea struck me, and they did, with increasing frequency as I watched others fumble through problems I could solve in my sleep, a voice inside whispered Margaret's mantra: wait, don't speak, hold back, let them figure it out on their own. And I did. But the more I waited, the more others spoke, filling the silence I'd created with their own voices, their own versions of my unrealized thoughts. One crisp December morning, when frost covered the office windows like crystallized regret, a colleague presented my data analysis in the main presentation room. Not just my data, my words, my templates, my methodology, even my color coding system for risk assessment. The presentation unfolded on the large screen like a movie of my own ideas performed by someone else. The room was impressed. Heads nodded. Pens scribbled notes. My boss, wearing that particular smile he reserved for moments of discovered genius, turned to my colleague and said, "Great insight. This shows real leadership thinking." My heart clenched like a fist. My palms grew damp against my notebook's leather cover. I stared at the table's wood grain, counting the lines and imperfections, silent, while inside I was screaming, "That's my work! Those are my conclusions! I spent 3 weekends perfecting that model." But I didn't say a word. I followed Margaret's advice. I stayed quiet, stayed invisible, stayed irrelevant. Day by day, I faded further into the corporate background. People stopped asking for my input, turning instead to others who had learned to project their voices, to claim space in conversations. My work hours stretched longer as I tried to compensate with effort what I couldn't achieve with visibility. But my efforts only fueled someone else's spotlight. I became the ghost writer of my own career, crafting success stories for other people to tell. One late evening in January, when the heating system rattled through empty corridors like the breath of a sleeping giant, I was alone in the office except for the cleaning crew. Their quiet efficiency as they emptied trash cans and vacuumed around my desk was a reminder of all the other invisible people who kept this place functioning. I stood by my cubicle's small window, staring at the city lights that twinkled like earthbound stars, feeling the void inside me grow with each breath. Before shutting down my computer, I noticed my boss's office door was ajar, warm light spilling into the darkened hallway like liquid gold. Laughter drifted out. Genuine, appreciative laughter that I hadn't heard directed toward my work in months. Inside was the new project leader, the one who'd been appointed to oversee my area of expertise, despite knowing far less than I did about the intricacies of our market segment. He sat in the leather chair I'd imagined myself occupying someday, gesturing confidently as my boss leaned back with the relaxed posture of someone whose faith in his judgment had been validated. "You're amazing," my boss was saying, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine admiration. "This is exactly the kind of vision I love to see." This is what leadership looks like. Those words stabbed at my heart with surgical precision. His so-called vision was built on my reports, crafted from my silent moments in meetings, constructed with insights I'd developed during countless late nights when the office was empty except for the security guard's distant footsteps. My research had become his roadmap, my analysis his compass, my sleepless dedication his stepping stone to recognition. That night, lying in bed with streetlights casting moving shadows through my blinds, staring at a ceiling that seemed to press down with the weight of my accumulated disappointments, I thought, why am I like this? Why did I choose to stay silent? Why did I let someone else shine with my light? I grabbed my phone, its blue glow harsh in the darkness, and scrolled through social media feeds filled with other people's highlight reels. A quote popped up, shared by someone whose profile picture showed them receiving an award I'd never have the chance to earn. "The greatest regret is the words left unsaid." It hit me like lightning striking a dead tree, illuminating everything in one brilliant, terrible flash. That was me. That was exactly who I'd become. In the days that followed, my frustration grew like a tumor, fed by every meeting where my voice went unheard, every presentation built on my uncredited work. My boss noticed me less in meetings, his eyes sliding past me as if I were part of the furniture. He gave me fewer responsibilities, saying with casual indifference, "Just support from the back. You're good at that." I became the invisible workhorse, the engine that powered other people's success without anyone bothering to look under the hood. Finally, I mustered the courage to confront him. It was a Thursday afternoon, and his office smelled of expensive coffee and leather polish. Awards lined his bookshelf, recognition for work I'd contributed to but would never be acknowledged for. "Why aren't you considering me for leadership roles?" I asked, my voice smaller than I'd intended. He looked up from his computer screen with mild surprise, as if a piece of office equipment had suddenly started talking. He shrugged with the casual dismissiveness of someone who'd never had to fight for recognition and said, "You stay too far in the background. You need to step up. Be more visible. Leadership is about presence, not just performance." Anger surged through me like electricity through copper wire. I'd stayed in the background because he and others had told me to. Now they were punishing me for following their advice? The irony was suffocating, thick as smoke in a closed room. They'd created my invisibility and were now criticizing me for it, like architects complaining about the foundation they'd designed. That evening, on the subway again, surrounded by the familiar sounds of urban transit, the screech of brakes, the rustle of newspapers, the electronic chimes announcing stops, my eyes welled up with tears I'd been holding back for months. I clutched my notebook, its pages filled with ideas I'd never voiced, solutions I'd never shared, innovations that could have moved the company forward, but instead sat silent in my private archive. Reading through them made my chest tighten with the physical pain of wasted potential. Solutions that could have revolutionized our approach were coming out of other people's mouths, dressed in their words, claimed as their insights. I whispered to myself in the train's mechanical rhythm, "If you keep this up, you'll stay invisible forever. You'll become a footnote in someone else's success story." But fear still lingered, cold and persistent as winter fog. What if I spoke up and they thought I was arrogant? What if I was ostracized, labeled as difficult, as someone who didn't understand the unspoken rules? What if my career didn't just stagnate but crashed entirely? I was trapped between fear and anger, suspended like dust in the space between ambition and safety. Each day, I sank a little deeper into that quicksand of my own making. But that low point was also the prelude to my breaking point. Because it's in your darkest moments that you're forced to find your light, to strike the match that illuminates the path forward. For me, that moment was closer than I realized. Early one morning in February, when winter still gripped the city but hints of spring lurked in the lengthening daylight, I arrived at the office before anyone else. The security guard nodded from behind his desk, surprised to see someone so early. The fluorescent lights flickered to life in the quiet corridor with their familiar electronic stutter, and the coffee machine in the break room hummed as it warmed up, promising caffeine salvation. The building itself seemed to exhale in the pre-dawn quiet, settling into another day of corporate dreams and broken promises. I opened my laptop in the stillness, pulled my notebook from its drawer with hands that shook slightly with anticipation, and underlined in red ink the ideas I'd written but never shared. Each line was a small act of rebellion, a declaration of war against my own silence. I made myself a promise, small but irreversible, like a pebble starting an avalanche. From today, my inner voice, not someone else's advice, will guide my decisions. I will not disappear into the background of my own life. I wrote down 3 principles in block letters that seemed to glow on the page: visibility, value, speed. Visibility. My work would take center stage, would demand to be seen and acknowledged. Value. Every idea would deliver measurable results that couldn't be ignored or appropriated. Speed. No more hiding behind perfectionism or waiting for perfect moments. Just move forward, execute, learn, adapt. I left a 1-page counterbrief on my desk, positioned where I couldn't miss it, the problem I'd solve, who I'd work with, how I'd measure success. No more wait and see or let's think about it. It was time for try, do, learn, repeat. The week's critical meeting was the quarterly review, held in the executive conference room with its intimidating view of the city's financial district. Sales, product, and customer success were at the table, department heads who'd built their reputations on quarterly numbers and annual growth metrics. The room smelled of expensive cologne and barely contained anxiety. They were discussing the rising phenomenon of silent churn, customers whose usage dropped quietly before they canceled renewals, disappearing like ghosts without the courtesy of dramatic exits. Instead of taking my usual seat in the corner where shadows gathered and voices went unheard, I sat in the middle of the table where the morning light from tall windows would illuminate my face when I spoke. The leather chair felt different beneath me, more substantial, as if it were designed for someone who belonged in important conversations. As the presentation droned on, filled with the usual corporate speak about market conditions and competitive pressures, that old voice whispered Margaret's mantra: "Don't ask. Stay quiet. Don't make waves." This time, I ignored it completely. "May I ask a question?" I said, my voice cutting through the comfortable murmur of agreement that had settled over the room like dust. The room paused. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. 10 pairs of eyes turned toward me with expressions ranging from mild surprise to open curiosity. Some of these people hadn't heard me speak in a business context for months. "We're labeling churn as a price issue," I continued, feeling my voice grow stronger with each word. "But the data shows usage drops 2 months before renewal conversations even begin. Price complaints are just the final excuse, the easy explanation that makes everyone feel better about losing business. The real problem, as I see it, is an adoption gap, a fundamental disconnect between what we promise and what customers actually experience." My boss raised an eyebrow, a gesture I'd seen him make when genuinely intrigued rather than merely polite. "Go on." I opened the 5-slide analysis I'd prepared during those early morning hours when the office belonged only to me and my ambitions. The slides were clean, visual, compelling, every chart telling a story that had been hidden in plain sight. "I've created a 12-week heat map of feature usage patterns, cross-referenced with weekly active user traffic and support request volume," I said, clicking through visualizations that painted a picture clearer than anything we'd seen before. "I've identified 3 distinct phases in the customer lifecycle: early excitement, golden weeks, and decline. The critical insight is that in the golden weeks, weeks 4 through 8, internal training programs taper off, and our champion-building efforts lose momentum. That's where we fundamentally fail to bridge technical capability with actual business value. We treat our marketing campaigns as sales closers, but the product's second life doesn't begin for the customer until they see real ROI. The new project leader sitting across the table, the one who'd built his reputation on my uncredited analysis, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His objection came with the sharp edge of someone defending territory. "That's largely anecdotal. We've documented clear recovery patterns with strategic price reductions." I stayed calm, felt my pulse slow to a steady rhythm rather than the frantic beating that had characterized my previous interactions in this room. "Price cuts provide short-term symptom relief, not systematic solutions," I replied, meeting his gaze directly. "I've tracked the post-discount behavior in 3 accounts. Usage spikes for approximately 2 weeks following price reductions, then returns to decline patterns. The fundamental issue isn't economic, it's behavioral. We're treating a adoption disease with pricing medicine." A thoughtful silence settled over the room like snow, muffling the usual corporate noise. My boss clasped his hands on the polished table, a gesture I'd learned meant he was genuinely considering what he'd heard rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. "What do you propose?" "A 30-day pilot adoption team," I said, the plan flowing from my lips as if I'd been presenting executive strategies for years rather than hiding in cubicles. "Customer success, product, and data analytics working as a coordinated unit. We select 3 accounts representing different risk profiles, one actively declining, one stagnant with untapped potential, and one showing early expansion signals. Clear, measurable objectives. Achieve a 25% increase in feature adoption within 30 days. Establish 2 C-level touchpoints for each account. and improve renewal intent scores by 15 points minimum. Weekly progress reports with transparent metrics and a clearly defined stop-loss threshold. If the pilot fails to meet benchmarks, we terminate and extract learning. If it succeeds, we document the methodology and scale it into a repeatable playbook. Margaret, sitting to my left with her perfectly styled silver hair and expression of practiced neutrality, whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "Don't be so aggressive. This level of assertiveness will backfire on you." I turned to her with the smile I'd been practicing in mirrors for weeks, confident, professional, unshakable. "It's not aggressive," I replied, my voice carrying clearly across the room. "It's a controlled experiment with defined parameters and measurable outcomes. The difference between aggression and leadership is methodology." My boss considered for a moment that felt like an hour, his fingers drumming once against the leather portfolio that held his notes and decisions. Then he nodded with the decisive motion of someone who'd recognized something valuable. "Pilot approved. Build your cross-functional team. First checkpoint meeting scheduled for next week. I want to see preliminary results." As the meeting ended and conversations resumed around the table, I felt a strange cocktail of emotions. Fear at what I'd committed to, adrenaline at finally having spoken my truth, and quiet defiance at the voice that had kept me silent for so long. The fear was real. Failure now would be public, visible, career-defining. But for the first time in years, failure felt preferable to invisibility. Out in the corridor, where the familiar hum of office life resumed its daily rhythm, I immediately texted 3 people who'd been waiting in my mental contacts list. Daria from Customer Success, whose field experience gave her insights no spreadsheet could capture. Emre from Product Management, whose technical knowledge ran deeper than his quiet demeanor suggested. And Can from Data Analytics, whose ability to find patterns in chaos bordered on supernatural. That afternoon, we commandeered an empty meeting room on the 3rd floor and transformed it into our war room. The space was small, windowless, furnished with a circular table that had seen better decades and a whiteboard that still held ghost traces of previous brainstorming sessions. But it felt like mission control for something important. I wrote 3 columns on the whiteboard with blue marker: insights, interventions, metrics. For the first 2 hours, I did something I'd forgotten how to do in formal business settings. I listened, really listened, not just waited for my turn to speak. Daria shared field stories that painted pictures no data visualization could capture. First month, everyone's excited. Training sessions are well attended. Internal champions are engaged. Expectations are high. Second month, the reality sets in. Internal project teams disperse to other priorities. Our primary contacts get buried under competing initiatives, and our emails start getting the polite but delayed responses that signal declining attention. Emre sighed with the weariness of someone who'd watched great products fail due to poor execution. There's a key feature that could dramatically improve their workflow efficiency, but access is buried behind a beta label and requires 2 additional navigation clicks that most users never discover. Ken pulled up a chart on his laptop that showed patterns invisible to naked eye analysis. Weeks 6 and 7 show a consistent engagement drop across all customer segments, regardless of company size, industry, or initial enthusiasm levels. The aha moment hit me like recognition rather than revelation. "So the golden weeks represent a perfect storm," I said, standing at the whiteboard with marker in hand. "Both our training infrastructure and their product accessibility break down simultaneously." I wrote our intervention plan in 4 clear phases. 1. Internal Champion Kit, a 10-minute video specifically designed for the client's project owner, featuring 2 ROI-focused slides and a templated internal demonstration plan that made their job easier rather than adding to their burden. 2. Product Friction Diet. Remove the confusing beta label, reduce key workflow completion from 7 clicks to 5, and add contextual tooltips that appeared precisely when users needed guidance most. 3. C-Level Bridge Program. 2 strategic touchpoints. 1 celebrating measurable progress. 1 proactively addressing potential risks and resource blockers before they became problems. 4. Signal-based outreach. CAN's alert system would flag 3 consecutive days of declining usage, triggering Daria's personalized follow-up to collect why data rather than generic satisfaction surveys. By evening, when the cleaning crew began their rounds and the building settled into its after-hours quiet, we'd sent our intervention plan to the first client, a mid-size consulting firm whose usage had dropped 30% over 6 weeks. The next morning, CAN's monitoring dashboard showed longer session times and improved completion rates for the key feature we'd simplified. On day 3, the client held their internal demonstration session, and their C-level sponsor sent an email that made my hands tremble as I read it. "We're finally seeing the product's real impact on our operational efficiency. This is what we hoped for when we first signed on." Daria texted me from the field. "They're talking about early renewal and expanding to 2 additional departments." My throat tightened with emotion. I'd forgotten I could feel at work, but I forced myself to stay measured, professional. "Excellent. Log the feedback, measure the engagement metrics, and let's not make any rushed decisions. We have 27 days left to prove this works systematically." I wrote the weekly executive update in the style I'd been perfecting: short, bullet-pointed, data-driven, hypothesis tested, interventions implemented, early signals detected, next steps defined. Each sentence embodied my value principle: no corporate speak, no hedged language, just clear communication of measurable results. Hitting send on that email felt like my voice finally echoing off walls that had absorbed my silence for too long. At the coffee machine the next morning, Margaret appeared beside me like a specter from my past life of strategic invisibility. "Sometimes fitting in really is the best long-term strategy," she said, her tone carrying the implication that my recent assertiveness was a temporary aberration that would correct itself once reality set in. I set my coffee cup down on the counter with deliberate care, meeting her eyes with the steady gaze I'd been practicing. "Fitting in isn't staying still," I replied. "It's agility. It's adapting to change and leading others through the adaptation process. What you call fitting in, I call stagnation." She didn't respond immediately, but I could see the calculation in her eyes, the recalibration of how she'd categorized me in her mental organizational chart. The silence between us felt like the old me, but I wasn't standing in that silence anymore. I was standing in something entirely different: the space that opens up when you stop apologizing for your own competence. Back in our war room, I drew a giant arrow on the whiteboard pointing toward our future: pilot to playbook. In 2 weeks, we'd present our interim findings to the executive board. Success would scale across the organization. Failure would teach us valuable lessons about implementation challenges. Either way, this time, the spotlight would shine directly on me. 3 weeks into the pilot, the impact was undeniable. What had started as small sparks of improved engagement had grown into a controlled blaze of measurable success. 2 of the 3 clients we'd expected to lose not only signed early renewals, but expanded their service agreements. The third was actively negotiating growth packages that would double their annual contract value. My boss reviewed the interim report in his office, surrounded by the leather-bound books and framed degrees that signified his own climb through corporate hierarchies. When he finished reading, he looked up with genuine curiosity rather than his usual polite interest. "How did you pull this off?" he asked. "These results are significantly better than anything we've seen in similar time frames." I wanted to say, because I finally stopped listening to advice that kept me small and started listening to my own strategic instincts. Instead, I chose precision over poetry. We combined systematic discipline with controlled experimentation. We identified the root cause rather than treating symptoms, tested targeted solutions, and measured results at every stage. Most importantly, we treated each client as a unique case study rather than applying generic solutions. The numbers spoke a language no one could misinterpret. Customer satisfaction scores had increased by an average of 23%. Feature adoption rates had improved by 37%. Most significantly, renewal intent scores had jumped by 42% across all pilot accounts. The data painted a picture so clear that even the most skeptical board member couldn't argue with the results. At the monthly board meeting held in the executive boardroom on the building's top floor, My report occupied center stage. The mahogany table reflected the city lights visible through floor-to-ceiling windows, and the air carried the weight of decisions that would affect hundreds of employees and millions in revenue. Board members sat with their leather portfolios and expensive pens. Men and women who'd built their careers on reading between the lines of presentations exactly like mine. A senior executive, someone whose name appeared on industry publications and whose opinions shaped quarterly earnings calls, broke the contemplative silence that had settled over the room. This represents one of the most promising strategic developments we've documented in over 2 years. The methodology appears scalable, the results are measurable, and the resource requirements are reasonable. For the first time in my career, my name was directly associated with the word promising, not as a footnote or attribution, but as the primary author of something valuable. With recognition came responsibilities that felt both thrilling and terrifying. I went from crafting reports in shadows to generating strategic recommendations under bright lights. The cost was immediate and steep. 12-hour days became 14-hour nights. Expectations escalated from competent to exceptional, and the margin for error shrank to nearly zero. One evening, well past 9 p.m., when most of the building had emptied except for security guards and obsessive overachievers, my coffee had gone cold in its cup while I worked through implementation challenges on 3 different client accounts. The city lights outside my window had blurred into streams of gold and white, and my computer screen cast the only light in our makeshift war room. Daria appeared in the doorway, her coat over her arm and exhaustion visible in the set of her shoulders. "You know what's interesting?" she said, settling into the chair across from me. "Since we started this pilot, I've been getting thank you emails from clients." Actual gratitude. Usually, we just get complaints, requests for discounts, or threats to cancel. This feels different. I looked up from the spreadsheet where I'd been tracking engagement metrics across 17 different data points. "Because we're selling them realized value instead of theoretical potential," I said. "We're not just providing a product, we're engineering their success." Daria nodded thoughtfully. "And that engineered success became visible because of your willingness to make the methodology visible. Before, good results happened randomly. Now they happen systematically." I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of what we'd built together. Yes, visibility. That was the missing element all along. Not just visibility of results, but visibility of the process that creates results. The transformation in meeting dynamics was remarkable and immediate. Where once my presence had been peripheral, now people took notes when I spoke. Pens moved across paper, capturing not just my conclusions but my reasoning process. Before, my ideas had been appropriated and filtered through other voices. Now, colleagues wanted to hear directly from the source, to understand not just what I recommended, but why I recommended it. Margaret, still a fixture at the conference table with her perfectly pressed blazers and calculated expressions, maintained her position in our evolving office ecosystem. One day, after a particularly successful presentation about scaling our pilot methodology across all customer segments, she fell into step beside me in the corridor where motivational posters hung like corporate prayer flags. "I have to admit," she said, her tone carrying something I'd never heard from her before, genuine respect mixed with carefully concealed surprise. "I underestimated your potential for strategic leadership." I didn't reply immediately, letting the admission hang in the air between us like incense. In my head, I thought, your underestimation became my motivation. Your advice to stay invisible taught me the value of strategic visibility, but I'd grown enough to recognize that some thoughts were better left unspoken, that true confidence didn't require verbal victories over people who'd once held power over my self-perception. "Thank you," I said simply, my voice carrying neither triumph nor resentment, just acknowledgement of her recognition and my own growth beyond her expectations. Not everything proceeded smoothly. Success, I learned, attracts attention, and attention attracts both opportunities and challenges in equal measure. One of our biggest clients, a financial services firm whose account represented nearly 8% of our annual revenue, hit a catastrophic system failure that crashed their primary trading platform during peak market hours. The failure wasn't directly related to our service, But our integration was embedded deep enough in their architecture that we couldn't escape association with the crisis. Phones rang nonstop in our office, their electronic shrilling cutting through conversations and concentration like air raid sirens. Email inboxes overflowed with urgent messages marked critical and immediate response required. The atmosphere in our usually calm workspace became electric with crisis energy, that particular combination of adrenaline and dread that accompanies moments when careers can, they told me to stay quiet. But I'll loudly remind you, like the video, subscribe, and join the story.